How can you create a product if you don't know what your manager is expecting of you? How can you be a part of a process that you don't understand? Hello and welcome to the Marcus Williams Training Academy podcast, where we talk about all things misconduct, whether it be the behaviors, the employees, the managers, the organization's response, things that impact everyone. If you work with human beings, if you're around human beings, you have to deal with misconduct in some way, shape, or form. Today's episode is another segment of If I Were in Charge. Now, how many of you have been driving home from work, or you're on the bus or you're on the subway, something bad happens, something you didn't agree with, and you think to yourself, man, if only I were the CEO, if only I were the boss, if I were in charge, we wouldn't have these problems. If I were in charge, I would do X, Y, or Z. If I were in charge, I would treat my employees better. I would pay them more. I would do this. I would make more money for the company. I have this idea to make things efficient. All of these things that you would do if you were in charge. And my question is, why aren't you in charge? We all have our roles. Maybe you're working up in the organization, you're learning, you're growing, whatever it is. If you have a great idea, share the idea. Go to someone who will listen, try to implement it. You can't blame them for not implementing something if you never talk to them about it. Okay, so that's a little bit of a side note. But before we get started in the actual content of the podcast, please take the time to subscribe, hit that button right now. Whatever service you're on, use their notifications so that you're notified every time that we release a new episode. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review, share with your friends, comment, share on your social media. Please help us spread this because, like I said, this applies to everyone. All right. If I were in charge, training is a very important part of your employment. Everyone, you may have gone to college or a trade school, or you've learned your trade in some way. You received training to the point where you are now good at your job. You're getting paid to do what you were educated in or what you were trained to do. That's great. But when it comes to misconduct, very rarely is anyone actually trained on what to do. I did an earlier episode about a Disney employee who was facing some misconduct from his manager, and people told him to go to HR, and he didn't know what that meant. He didn't know what HR was, what they did, why people would tell him to go to HR. He didn't receive that training. When misconduct happened, he didn't know what to do, and he had to deal with it alone. The people who are in charge of investigating, looking into misconduct, how much training do they actually have on investigations? Is it something that just someone told you what to do? I went and talked to an HR director of a company once, and we were talking about some of the training programs that I offer, and I asked him, who trained you on doing misconduct investigations? Because he was in charge of them for the organization. It was a worldwide company. And he said, well, the guy who had the position before me. And then my question was, well, who trained him? Was it the guy that had the position before him? Where in that long line of training or succession was someone actually trained by an expert, by someone who knows what they're talking about? Or did someone someday just kind of figure it out and just muddle along and hope they didn't get in trouble, and things that worked and things that didn't work, and they just kind of pass that along? So we just patch it together and cross our fingers that everything works out. And I think that's how a lot of organizations work. Even if you have a degree in human resources, you don't get a lot of training on investigating, actual investigations. You may get training on different options for discipline and how to handle it and what you can and you can't do when it comes to employee discipline. But did anyone ever actually teach you how to interview a witness, how to interview a complainant or a respondent, how to talk to a witness, how to identify evidence? All of those things that are so important to conduct a good investigation. Now, if you're just an employee and you say, well, I'm not part of the investigative team, what does this have to do with me? Well, if you one day have to go to human resources with a complaint. Something bad happens to you. Or let's turn it the other way. What if you are accused of something and you know that complaint went to HR and now they're investigating and you say, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. Would you rather have someone who knows what they're doing, who's been trained on investigations to actually do that investigation? Are you going to trust that more than someone who just is kind of figuring it out as he goes and is basing what he or she does on the last guy who had that position? So this impacts everyone. So say you reach out to get some training. Do you train everyone on everything? Do you go specific? How do you organize that? So this is where we're getting into the crux of it. And this actually applies more to universities. I'm talking a lot right now to Title IX. So Title IX is a federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. Sexual harassment falls under that, and sexual misconduct in universities. So sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, domestic violence fall under Title IX. So if a student is impacted by one of those things while they're a student, they can go to the Title IX office, and the Title IX office has a coordinator who coordinates all the complaints and an investigator who investigates. And then they have other roles. They have a decision maker, someone who actually hears the complaint, reads the investigation, and decides what happens, whether the complaint is, the evidence shows that there should be a finding or not. So there are these different roles. The coordinator who's coordinating the efforts, the investigator who's doing the investigation, the decision maker. Maybe you have an appeals process. And your company may be set up in a similar way. Is the same person who does your HR investigation going to make the decision, or does that go to management? And then what if you appeal that? Do you have the ability to appeal? So they all have different roles. In Title IX, it's formalized. But in your company, it might not be quite as formal. It depends on your policy, depends on how formalized and well-written your policy is. But here's what happens a lot in Title IX, and I see this because I offer training for Title IX, is my training is focused on the investigations. That's my background, 20 years of investigating. And so I had a conversation with someone who said, well, I don't need to go to your training because I'm the coordinator. I don't do investigations. Do you have coordinator training? And then I looked online, kind of looking at what other companies offered for their training, for their Title IX training. And that's what they do, is they have separate training for each role. There's coordinator training, investigator training, decision maker training. And that's problematic because it's a team effort. All of Title IX, all of those roles don't happen in a vacuum. They all are part of the same process. So if you're the coordinator and you don't know what your investigator is doing, you don't understand that. And I've been in that place where I've had a boss who didn't really understand investigations, and she would make comments sometimes, and I'd have to say, no, that's not actually how I do it. This is how it happens. But if you're the boss, if you're the coordinator, if you're coordinating investigations, you need to know what an investigation looks like. When you read a report, when you look at a file, when you talk to your investigator about their status or what's going on, or when you talk to the complainant, when the report initially comes in and you're explaining, we're going to investigate this. These are the options. This is what we're looking at. Do you know what you're talking about? An investigator clearly needs training on an investigation, on what to do. But what about the decision maker? They're not conducting the investigation. They have no part of the process until it's all done. And then they just look at it and make a decision. Why do they need that investigations training? Well, if you're looking at a report, an investigative report, you need to be able to know what happened, all of the steps that were taken to create that report. What does a good investigation look like? Can you look at a report and say, oh, there's a problem here. This investigator should have done A, B, or C. Or, yeah, they did X and Y, but forgot Z. The only way you're going to be able to know that and be able to say, oh, there should have been evidence here that was never looked at or uncovered, or there's holes in the investigation here because this person wasn't talked to. How do you know that if you've never been trained on what an investigation should look like? You're not going to know. You need to have that background or that basis of knowledge, And then you're looking at it, and the decision maker has to decide, has to know how to evaluate that, has to be able to look at that information and that evidence and say, does this evidence meet my standard? Is there a preponderance of evidence here that I can use to have a finding or not? And they're not going to know how to do that, how to evaluate evidence, how to look at it, unless they've been trained on what a good investigation looks like. So back to that person, that coordinator who asked me that question, I said, no, my training is for everyone. You all need this training. Now, there are things that a coordinator needs to know that may not be included. That's a little extra. So maybe there's a breakout session here, or you need to do a little bit of extra reading. So there are some specialties, but everyone needs to know what everyone else is doing. What about the investigator? Does the investigator need to know what the coordinator's job is? What the boss's job is? Yes. How can you create a product if you don't know what your manager is expecting of you? How can you be a part of a process that you don't understand the perspective? And that applies to any kind of process or role in your company, no matter what your job is, not just misconduct. If you don't understand what the company's looking for, what the goals are, what they need you to achieve from their higher level perspective, how are you going to achieve or do the job that they are hiring you to do if you don't understand it, if you don't know it? So my response is, you need to be versed. You need to be the expert at your job, but you need to know the job or understand or be familiar with the job of the people on your team. So you know how everything goes together and how everything works. And that comes down to training, which of course always comes down to budget. It costs more money. To train everyone, it costs more money. So if I were in charge, which is the title of this segment, I would prioritize that training. I would prioritize the funds because the response is so important. And the liability when you do it wrong is so large. Would you rather spend a couple $1,000s extra making sure all of your team members are trained on the process and what's happening, or have one person, two people doing opposite things? It ends up screwing up the entire response, and you end up getting sued, and you're liable for a settlement or for millions of dollars or thousands of dollars. It's worth the time and the money to create a team that will do it right. And the only way they can do it right is if everyone is trained together. So that focus is more applicable directly to Title IX. So if you are in the Title IX world, but it applies everywhere. It applies to corporations as well. In your misconduct response, you need to have a comprehensive program. And that goes down to the employees or students, in the case of Title IX, knowing what to do, what you're doing. Again, back to the example of the person who didn't know that HR existed or what they were for, or that you needed to go to them. If you don't train your employees and let them know that this is how you file a complaint, this is who you go to for help, and when you do, this is the process, this is what is going to happen, and we know this is going to happen because we have a defined process. And hey, by the way, here's our investigator. This is the person who's going to investigate, and they are trained. They know what they're doing. And managers, if someone comes to you, where do you go with it? What do you do? Do you just try to handle it yourself, or do you take it to that trained person, that trained team in human resources? Training needs to be comprehensive throughout the entire organization. And for that reason, in my program, so say my Title IX training program, I have training that the people doing the job all go through that same training. And then I have training for all the people on the outside, all the teachers or professors or employees, so they know what to do if a student comes to them for help as well. Those same principles apply. All right, so this is a little bit shorter episode this week, but if I were in charge of preparing your company's misconduct response program, I would make sure that everyone in your organization is trained. All right, so please check out my other episodes. If you haven't already, go back and listen to the previous episodes. Again, subscribe and share. That I would really appreciate it. And I will see you next time on the Marcus Williams Training Academy podcast.